A.D. 3300. Chapter 1. Grim laughter, raucous but coordinated singing, simple but emotive chants. The solidarity of workers standing together to assert their rights. Crudely made banners held high in grubby, roughened hands. Defiance, anger, and resolve. Women and children marching alongside their menfolk in defiance of curfew, claiming ground, demanding to be heard. Flags waving, feet stamping, a crowd seeking confrontation. The protest had been watched for some time. It gathered strength, firebrand agitators whipping the crowd to a fury. A number of independent protests merged and converged towards the Loren Piazza, the ornate gardens that now surrounded the administrative center of Eastern City. They were off-limits to all but Imperial citizens, patrolled by guards. Military forces were brought to guard the administrative buildings, but the perimeter of the piazza was too expansive to be adequately defended. The chants were predictable, the cry of the overworked and underfed. Even slaves had rights that were being abused. Thousands had come, thousands who knew their actions could result in the legal deaths of both themselves and their families. Thousands who felt they had little to lose. The crowd stepped up to the edge of the piazza, where a single captain of the guard stood facing them, backed up by a phalanx of armed men, automatic rifles held ready. The captain's arm was outstretched, palm facing outwards. "Who speaks for you?" the captain demanded. A man pushed through the crowd. Bearded and unkempt, he nonetheless carried an air of authority and stood tall, his bearing strong and erect despite shabby clothes. He stepped a few paces forward from the now silent crowd. "I do." Both men looked each other over carefully. Each assessed and measured, sizing up and evaluating the other. "Ryger," the captain said, with a brief nod. "Captain Doofus," Ryger acknowledged, with a correspondingly faint smile. "You will disperse and return to your work," the captain said, raising his voice to the crowd and casting a look towards them over Ryger's shoulder. "If you do this immediately, this infringement of curfew will go unpunished." Ryger turned, sweeping his arms wide to take in the crowd, who remained unmoved. He spun back around to Doofus with a laugh. "I don't think you've convinced them, Doofus." Doofus stepped forward, motioning to Ryger. Ryger stepped forward. The two men spoke in hushed tones. "Where's this going, Ryger?" "We want relaxed working hours, 3 meals a day, a place by the sea and a holiday off-world, first-class hotel passes, our own private transport system, a nice hot shower." "Anything else?" "And I want to personally fuck all 3 of the senator's daughters." "Don't we all? And what will you settle for?" "Just the older 2. Not so bothered about the dark head freak." Doofus stifled a laugh. "I meant on behalf of your protest." "Our working hours as they would be in the corner of the Empire. Medical supplies, food and drink, accommodation that's not full of shit and bugs. You know our demands. We want our rights, that's all. We're Imperial slaves, not vagabonds. A decree from the Senator that this will be done. Signed by the patrons." "And if you don't receive this?" "Tantalite mining stops. Maybe Senator Olgreb loses his head. Feelings are running high, Doofus. We can't keep a lid on this forever. The Senator's madness must be dealt with." "He'll order you starved out, you know that." "Think we haven't planned this? We can last far longer on what we've stashed away than Olgreb can, whilst trying to placate his buyers without having a product to sell. We know the situation. We've got off-world contacts. Buyers will go elsewhere for tantalum if they need to. If the buyers go, we all lose. Unlike you with your very fine uniform and fancy food, we ain't got that much to lose. If you take the time to notice, begging your pardon, we figure Olgreb has more at stake than we do. All we're asking for is our rights." "Let me send that in." "You do that." Ryger stepped back a pace. Doofus turned and walked a few steps across the piazza, touching a finger to his ear and beginning a conversation with a third party. He turned to look at Ryger, part way through the conversation. Ryger stood, awaiting the outcome. Doofus frowned. Ryger caught a little of what he said. "Not necessary. We can handle—" A cry of dismay went up from the crowd. Armed personnel carriers and assault vehicles appeared from behind the administrative buildings. Even from hundreds of meters away, it was obvious they were bristling with dark and forbidding weapons. Heavy caliber chain guns, rocket and incendiary launchers. They hovered, turning towards the crowd. Doofus turned, holding both hands up in a clear message. "Hold your fire!" A sharp crack echoed across the piazza. Doofus spun around, stumbling to his knees, a bright red stain spreading across his tunic. Ryger stepped back in alarm and surprise, arms held up in a gesture of innocence. Doofus fell, full length on the floor. The guards surged forwards towards Ryger, rifles at the ready. As they did so, there came a deafening explosion from across the piazza. The right side of the administrative building collapsed in a shower of debris and flame. The guards were sprawled to the floor by the air blast as it whipped past. Massive chunks of masonry spun through the air and landed across the piazza, shattering into boulders and dust as they did so. Another flung upwards into the sky, smashed into one of the personnel carriers, crushing the stabilizer at the rear and spinning it out of control. Men and equipment tumbled out to be dashed to fragments on the ground. The carrier itself careened across the sky, trailing smoke and debris, before spiraling into the terrified crowd in a whirling maelstrom of disintegrating metal. People screamed and surged backwards as rubble rained down. The guards struggled back to their feet, catching Ryger as they did so. Ryger disappeared under the mass of bodies. "Not us! Not us!" he was yelling as rifle butts descended. His voice was lost as the roar of noise descended from above. The armed vehicles tilted forward and accelerated towards the panicking crowd. The sharp bark of weapons fire reverberated across the gardens. Tracer fire split the air, shattering pavements, ornamental statues, and marble colonnades. Rockets streaked with ear-splitting shrieks, terminating their flights in lurid flashes of color and destruction. Then, the rapacious fire found softer targets: skin, flesh, and bone. Dozens of slaves were cut down, many trampled underfoot as those that had yet to be hit stumbled away in blind fear. This was no orderly retreat. Men, women, and children fought wildly to escape in the dreadful rout. The lethal barrage continued, indiscriminately targeting the slaves as they tried to flee. Ripped banners, shredded flags, and bloodied bodies littered the edge of the piazza. Yet still, the onslaught continued. One wretched family cowered in front of blazing guns as they tracked around. They were caught in the firing line and slain as they huddled in terror. The parents first, and then their child, thrown through the air to join the wretched mass of bodies. "Stop! Enough!" The vehicles froze, motionless. The people stopped moving, some of them in the act of falling to the ground. Bullets hovered mysteriously in mid-air. The sound was abruptly silenced. "Doofus was a good man. I knew him from childhood. He deserved better than to die in this manner, for a mere slave revolt." A wispy, silver-haired elderly gentleman stepped carelessly through the holofac recording, making it blur and flicker, unaffected by the frozen carnage around him. He was thin, almost to the point of emaciation, his pale flesh and skin seeming to barely hide the skeleton within. His cream and gold-braided toga swept past the crushed and blooded bodies, unstained. A pair of optical enhancers perched precariously on his nose.
"Patron Zaire, I think you can see from this footage that the slave revolt is incidental. If there is blame, it lies elsewhere. The slaves have no access to explosives of that magnitude. That was clearly technology from off-world. The Federation is behind this, supporting these reclamist rebels."
The second voice was owned by an exceedingly large gentleman, also wrapped in copious quantities of fine linen. Despite this, his girth was barely constrained. The contrast between the two couldn't have been more striking. He reclined in an ornately wrought chaise longue, lazily consuming fruit from a nearby bowl, belching on occasion in appreciation, and then wiping his lips with the back of his hand. An immaculately trimmed goatee beard completed the visage, adequately concealing a series of flabby chins. Garin was no beauty, but a fierce intellect resided within the vastness of unappealing flesh.
"And what do these confounded reclamists want, Patron Garin? They've made no formal demands. Remnants of the original colonists, we suspect. Those that didn't have the decency to perish 3 years ago when we reclaimed this moon. They leave their usual calling card, an anonymous text transfer moments before reclaiming what is ours.
Zaire nodded as he quoted from memory.
I've seen it. Needlessly melodramatic. One assumes they regard this moon as theirs. It's difficult to convince those who lack an appreciation of the law.
Perhaps they are unhappy with how the law was applied.
A third voice spoke from the back of the room. Zaire turned with a glare, but Garen raised his hand in greeting, before adjusting his position and resuming his consumption of fruit.
Ah, Patron Dulk.
They could have been evacuated rather than murdered.
He was a tall man, bald and tanned, with an erect, almost military bearing. He held his head high, with what most considered was a haughty and arrogant look. His dress was in sharp contrast to the other patrons. A thick and heavy dark grey trench coat that gave the suggestion it concealed more than it revealed. The skin of his face was leathery, clearly a man who'd lived much of his life outdoors. His hands remained gloved, despite the warmth inside the presentation room.
Patron Dulk,
Zaire acknowledged with a faint measure of distaste. His eyes narrowed.
You don't claim that these reclamists have a genuine grievance, surely?
Not in the slightest. Yet we should not underestimate them. We know that they are backed by the Federation, and it would seem their leader has a measure of tactical ability.
The mysterious Vargo and his wizard Solonak. Both seem persons of some means. Our spies reveal nothing of value about them other than the names. Those that get close are executed rather efficiently.
The Reclamists are well organized as a result. They appear to be well versed in our capabilities. Spies, undoubtedly.
You seem impressed by them,
Zaire said. Dulk shrugged.
I merely reiterate that we could have avoided this problem by a less confrontational approach. A pattern that is playing out once again.
He gestured at the bloodshed portrayed before him.
What do you mean?
In much the same way as Senator Algreb sanctioned the original appropriation of this moon, he also directly instructed the military to undertake this disagreeable episode by personal command. Sympathy for the Reclamists runs high amongst the slaves now. They could overrun the military right now if they knew how weak our forces were. Fortunately, at this point they do not.
Garen looked around and stroked his beard thoughtfully.
I feared as much. The Senator's actions grow increasingly erratic. Perhaps...
We should not be having this conversation, patrons. We have pledged our support to consider any other course of action.
Should matters continue as they have, we risk inviting attention of the most unwanted variety. Our position is tenuous. A review of alternatives is only proper.
Dulk is right. The Senator's actions are destabilizing the situation. Slaves slaughtered by whim in the midst of a protest? If word gets off-world, we risk an inspection from the Emperor's agents. If the Reclamists gain the upper hand, or the slaves discover they are in a position of even greater power, well, I humbly submit this is not in our best interests. I've supported Senator Algreb for 40 years. Then perhaps a change is in order. And this is the answer, is it, Patron Dulk? Disenfranchise ourselves from the Loren family?
Dulk didn't say remove our support from the Loren family,
Garen observed, shrewdly. Dulk inclined his head appreciatively.
Indeed.
Then, you're not suggesting his daughters, surely? This is madness. None of them are fit to be a senator. The very thought of youthful exuberance being allowed access to power, it will be mayhem and carnage within days. As opposed to the mayhem and carnage of the last few days, you mean?
Garen gestured to the frozen tableau of slaughter behind them. Dulk nodded.
I'll admit that Algreb is increasingly overzealous in his application of the law.
An interesting definition of overzealous,
Garen commented, holding up his hands and looking from one to the other, as if puzzled.
I always get those two mixed up. Overzealous and genocide. Genocide, overzealous. They're only slaves. That's hardly grounds for considering. Speculating. Not considering. Merely debating a hypothetical solution to an intractable problem. There's no question of anything but unfailing support for the senator.
The room isn't bugged. I've checked.
Garen laughed.
Old habits die hard, my friend. And which one of the senator's glorious offspring are you considering, pray tell?
Zaire raged, raising his hands and waving them in frustration.
Corinne, whose greatest ever concern has been the precise arrangement of her hair and the cut of her dress? Darla, whose greatest asset is that she has so little personality that none of the nobles find her in any way objectionable? They're not even vaguely credible. There is a third, as I recall,
Garen prompted, with a mischievous grin. Zaire stopped in mid-flow.
Not Kahina. Please, anything but Kahina. I cannot abide that objectionable young woman.
She has the virtue of intelligence.
Tactless, antagonizing, self-assured, rude, arrogant, proud, scheming. A perfect Imperial daughter, one could argue cogently. I'm sure you agree. I'd imagine she could be housebroken, trained perhaps.
Tempered and molded.
Someone we could instruct and guide, influence and persuade.
In the best interests of stability and efficiency, naturally.
Upholding the everlasting Imperial values, peace and tranquility. Don't you agree? I do not. Tell me you're not taking this seriously.
Our situation is grave. Perhaps graver than we realize.
And what of the Senator himself? What do you intend to do about him?
Why, nothing at all. Our patronage remains loyal as it ever has. There's no question of our unfailing support.
Then what was this conversation about?
The Reclamists, of course.
They grow bolder every day. They've struck in the city. Perhaps they might even strike at the Senator's family. That would be truly tragic.
Tragic indeed. We must do everything to ensure the Loren lineage is protected.
Zaire frowned as he looked from one to the other. Then his eyes widened in appreciation. The Imperial Palace, home of the Loren family, had arguably the best view on the entire surface of Keone. It had been deliberately sited on the island of New Ithaca, itself part of an archipelago of islands in the otherwise empty Garian Sea. Its tropical latitude in the southern hemisphere of Keone afforded it a warm and pleasant climate at all times, with only occasional rainfall to mar the spectacle. Unlike the distant seas of old Earth, the water in the oceans was fresh and pure. Keone had been originally settled for its pastoral beauty, and the aesthetics were not lost on the denizens of the empire. Low in the northern sky, forever hanging in full view, its reflection sparkling in the bay, was the enormous blue orb of Daedalian, the ocean world. It was an enormous planet, with seas 100 kilometers deep. It hosted, so rumor had it, marine life of extraordinary size and might. Keone was Daedalian's only moon, forever locked to its parent, always facing it. The sun came and went, but Daedalian remained, marking the passage of time by its changing phases, going from crescent to full, back to crescent over the course of the day. Daedalian grew to its maximum brightness in the middle of the night, its full globe reflecting light back onto Keone, bathing the bay, plains and mountains in a fresh, azure glow. Thus it was never truly dark, a feature that both entertained and confused visitors. It was a perfect setting for the frequent soirees organized by the Loren lineage. Having one of the most stunning backdrops in the known galaxy ensured their gatherings were well attended by the cream of Imperial society, should they so wish it. The palace and its gardens had been specifically designed to cater for this view, and to augment it as effectively as possible. The palace was oriented north, directly towards Daedalian, with the gardens dropping through tiers downwards towards the beach that edged the bay. There were no roads or access routes. The island was entirely unspoilt. Supplies and visitors typically arrived at a small airport on the far side of the island directly from the mainland, and were then taken via an underground transport link to the palace. Unseen to the casual observer, the island was defended by a perimeter of anti-craft batteries and surface-to-air missile launchers, alongside a variety of shield technologies. Squadrons of defense craft were stationed on nearby islands just out of sight of New Ithaca, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. The island was, in the eyes of the military, somewhat overprotected, particularly as their resources were stretched thin trying to keep a handle on rising piracy and the activities of the Reclamists. The Senator had commanded it, however, so it was done without question. All this had been built in a scant couple of years following the appropriation of the system and the expulsion of the original settlers. The Lorens were nothing if not efficient. The head of the family, Senator Allgreb Loren, had inherited his grandfather's vast fortune at an early age, after the suspicious death of his father. Allgreb's father had, by most accounts, been something of a fool and a popinjay. Many suspected wider interests had intervened to ensure the succession. In their quest to ensure that family lineage and purity continued untainted, much care had to be given to the choice of marriage partner. Genetic engineering ensured the worst anomalies were avoided, but it wasn't possible to avoid them all. Allgreb, through uncertain means, shrewdly invested and enhanced his grandfather's legacy. The family's money continued to be made through mining of rare and exotic materials extracted with cheap labour. It had given him much scope for influence and put enormous power in his grasp. With the capability and the experience, the opportunity provided by Keone, given the sudden and unprecedented demand for tantalite, had been one for which Allgreb had been perfectly placed to take advantage. The entire household had moved to Keone, wife and mistresses, all discreetly housed in the remoter parts of the palace, his 3 daughters, their tutors, and a small army of guards, musicians, servants, and staff. Everything the imperial family had enjoyed back in the empire they enjoyed here. No compromise was accepted. This was often complemented by frequent visitors from the lesser noble families on the mainland, and visitors from the empire itself. A young woman entered through the grand foyer of the imperial palace and strode purposefully towards the dark panelled doors that formed the threshold of the reception hall. She knocked 3 times, quickly and sharply, in accordance with tradition. There was no immediate response. The woman waited, her arms folded impatiently, glaring at the closed doors. Her fingers tapped against her forearms. She was dressed simply, in a loose flowing pale green robe that fell to her ankles. Her hair, straight, dark, and cut at shoulder length, was braided by a thin crystal tiara. Her eyes were grey with a hint of blue, her skin pale and only lightly adorned with colour. Her stance was erect and commanding, her expression cool and aloof. 2 guards on the inside slowly pulled the doors inwards. The woman abased herself reverently, but kept her head up, with her expression unchanged. "Approach," a deep and melancholy voice intoned. It was only just audible from the opposite end of the hall. The woman resumed her stance and walked forward, conscious of her footsteps echoing on the mosaic floor. She kept her eyes locked ahead, only peripherally noticing murals, images and stories passing beneath her feet. Tales of conquest, resistance, victories, defeats, and famous last stands. She arrived at the foot of the dais and curtsied, reluctantly lowering her head down.
"You summoned me, Pater?"
"Arise." The woman stood up and looked directly at the owner of the voice. Steel-grey eyes stared back at her. Senator Allgreb Loren was still an imposing figure. Age had robbed him of some of his strength, but his stature and bearing was as intimidating as always. His face was lined and careworn, his eyes dark under heavy eyebrows. His expression was as inscrutable as it had ever been. "You remain a disappointment to me, my gloomily-haired daughter. I fear Chancellor a.k.a. Guntat is less than enamored with you. He claims that he fears an impure bloodline given your deformity." The woman unconsciously ran her hand through her dark hair. It was in sharp contrast to Allgreb's platinum blonde locks. "Yet your lack of charm and grace are doubtless the real reasons for declining the match. Your worth is less with each suitor we try. Fortunately, I have other daughters."
My impression of him is even less flattering. Would you like to hear it?
"Your impressions are of no concern to me whatsoever, Kahina. You have but a single purpose, to fulfill your duty in promoting the interests of the lineage by an appropriate match."
Find a match for me, then. All you've found so far are fools, lackeys, and inbred idiots.
The cream of imperial families we do well to associate ourselves with.
My description is more accurate.
The senator's eyes flashed angrily. "Must I punish you once more? Compliance is all I seek. Would that you had a use like your amiable sisters. They understand their place."
Punish me all you like. It won't work. You won't change me.
That remains to be seen. I will consider the matter. Perhaps there is still some minor contribution you can make to our advancement. In the meantime, take this to Kareen. She will succeed with a.k.a. Guntat where you have failed. Senator Allgreb handed out a comtab. Kahina snatched it from his hand.
Thank you for the privilege of carrying your messages. The opportunity to serve gives me much honor.
Allgreb bristled, But Kahina's words gave him no excuse to retort.
You will leave. Your very presence distresses me. Your pleasure and mine, Pater,
Kahina replied. She curtsied once more and turned smartly on her heel. She turned at the threshold, looking back and catching her father's eye. Allgreb waited for the customary and required nod of respect. Kahina's eyes narrowed and she whirled on her feet, walking away as the doors to the hall were closed by the guards. Allgreb's fists clenched. He initiated a holophag call. A tall, bald man appeared before him, turning around to face him and then bowing immediately.
Senator, a pleasure. How might I serve?
Patron Dulk, I have a task for you. My daughter Kahina is sick once more.
Dulk's eyes narrowed briefly.
I'm sorry to hear that, Senator.
She needs treatment. I'm sure you understand.
Indeed, Senator. I'll be there as soon as I can.
Allgreb nodded and closed the link, settling back in his plush chair, surveying the hall with a satisfied sigh. The maid ducked as a further piece of crockery smashed into the wall beside her. She stepped neatly to the side and waited patiently. The broken pieces tumbled to the floor, joining several more that were already lying there.
I said cream drapes, not tan drapes,
A high-pitched voice yelled from across the room. It was accompanied by a fierce glare and a flick of long blonde hair.
Do I have to repeat myself?
Kahina Loren was not an easy mistress to work for. The eldest of the senator's daughters, she was dazzlingly beautiful, with a perfect complexion, immaculate hair and manicured nails. She had impeccable taste in clothing, style and jewellery. At every social event, she always impressed and startled the men, whilst dominating and intimidating the women. She could be charming, sophisticated, elegant and debonair. Often she was quite the reverse. The maid sighed. It had been tan drapes when she'd set out to complete the instructions issued by her mistress this morning. Clearly Kahina had changed her mind in the interim, again. It wouldn't do to point this out.
Surely not, ma'am.
And is my dress ready yet, Marie?
We only gave the designs to the tailors at the midday meal, ma'am. I'm sure they will be working.
The soiree is this evening. I need time to get ready. Daedalian is already waxing. How long does it take? Do you expect me to wear rags?
No, ma'am.
Marie didn't smile. She knew what would happen if she did. The last maid to have made that mistake was now working in the sewers beneath the palace. Pointing out that Kahina had somewhere in the order of 2,000 other alternative gowns would probably not help either.
Do you have the dinner layout ready?
Marie handed her a com tab with the information she requested. Kahina scanned it carefully.
Viceroy Guwat can't come in after Chancellor Loquette. What were you thinking? He'll interpret it as a snub. Put Madame Vellier between them and change it around. Did you arrange for hot red wine? What about the fish? You remember Admiral Tavan hates fish. He's got to have fish after that insulting comment at the last concert.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, about my entrance. Grand staircase or front hall?
Staircase, surely, ma'am.
Marie answered dutifully. Kahina always came down the staircase. She loved watching the sea of faces arranged below in the vaulted foyer turn to look at her as she affected unconcern and surprise at their presence.
I think you're right. Music. You've got the East Coast Orchestra, haven't you?
Yes, ma'am. They cancelled their arrangements at your request.
Jambian Old Age or Satiquan Jazz?
Old age, I think. Most of the guests will be expecting old age music. Some absolutely hate the modern.
No, I don't think so. It's my evening. Instruct them to play jazz.
Yes, ma'am.
Marie sighed. Unlike her more artistic sister Tala, Kahina had little time for music. It was a tool to entertain and delight, or to annoy and infuriate. The entrance bells tolled. A gentle, harmonious collection of notes. Someone had approached Kahina's own personal wing of the palace.
Now what? Can I never have a moment's peace?
Ma'am?
Well, don't just stand there. Go and answer it. Or do you expect me to do it myself?
No, ma'am, of course not.
Stop blathering then. Go!
Marie found Kahina's youngest sister awaiting her. Marie had felt sorry for Kahina in the past. It was no secret that she was the least favoured of the three daughters on account of her dark hair. Imperial tradition held that this was a sign of impurity, of weakness and poor character. Unfortunately, Kahina did herself no favours by being deliberately awkward and antagonistic to all, regardless of whether they had any sympathy for her or not.
Kahina is not well disposed today,
Marie whispered, with a raised eyebrow. Kahina rolled her eyes.
Is anything else worthy of news? She may not receive you. I bring instructions direct from our exalted father. She has no choice.
Marie's eyes widened in astonishment.
The senator?
Has he decided? You overreach yourself, maid. This message is for Karin's ears only.
The maid bowed. Her sympathy for Kahina eroded further. She turned and led her up to Karin's chambers. She knocked gently.
Who is it? Your sister Kahina, with a missive from the senator, ma'am.
There was a pause. Karin was clearly wondering the same thing as Marie was.
Send her in.
Marie opened the door and showed Kahina in. She curtsied low and awaited a signal from Karin.
You may rise, sister. Most gracious of you, sister.
Marie, satisfied that protocol had been observed, made to leave and went to close the door behind her. Karin signalled her to remain. Kahina half turned aside.
My instructions were to give this message to you alone. Marie is my trusted servant,
Karin replied.
Nevertheless, my instructions... Are you suggesting I cannot choose trustworthy servants? Unlike you, I treat mine well and retain their services over a considerable period. Honoured sister, I would not dare to judge such... Then don't. What is this message our father sees fit to send me at this ungodly hour?
Kahina turned around the comm tab she'd been given, taking her time to access the information contained within.
I bring a missive from Senator Allgreb. I already know that. Don't waste my valuable time, sister.
Kahina read from the transcript.
The Senator demands your presence in the main hall at sundown today, there to discuss the arrangements for the long-awaited alliance of the representatives of the much-honoured Rebian family. What?
Karin shouted out immediately, making Marie flinch.
What about my soirée? I have 300 dignitaries en route. This appears to be the wrong season for soirees.
Karin threw a vase at her. Kahina was able to sidestep it. She knew her sister's tantrums well.
How dare you bring me this news? I am merely the humble messenger, exalted and much-favoured sister. The vessel into which our honourable father pours the fruits of his deliberations. How am I supposed to rearrange my soirée now? Tell me that. Surely my exalted sister isn't suggesting that we put our own entertainment before the needs of state,
Kahina said, tilting her head to one side. It was a clever riposte. Karin clearly had no choice but to do the senator's bidding, so she changed tack.
And for what? Some fool from Rebia? We hate the Rebians. Why does father need me anyway? Perhaps the rest of the missive will further enlighten my exalted sister.
Kahina was clearly enjoying herself. Karin scowled at her and gestured for Kahina to continue.
There to discuss the arrangements for the long-awaited truce with the exalted representative of Rebia, the most eminent Teclau Guntat, emissary and head of the lineage of Rebia, thrice decorated commander of the legions of Koran, being in truth the betrothal, nuptials, and tithes appropriate for the joining of two such honourable houses to prevent further bloodshed. Stop! What did you say?
Karin yelled, outraged. Kahina smiled innocently, took a deep breath, and started again.
There to discuss the arrangement, not that. The last bit, you dark-haired imbecile. Being in truth the betrothal, nuptials, and... What does that mean?
Kahina made a show of reading the missive again, as if trying to interpret it.
I believe, my exalted sister, you're about to be married. Congratulations.
Kahina looked up vindictively. Karin was aghast.
No, he can't do this. It's not fair. How dare he? I'm not some lackey he can dispose of at a whim for some cheap political game. I'm a pure and virtuous golden-haired daughter of the esteemed Loren lineage. This was supposed to be you, wasn't it? You were supposed to marry him. But he couldn't stomach your ugliness and your foul hair, could he? You forced this upon me, you scheming bitch. This was your plan all along. Enjoy Teclau Guntat. He's agreeable enough to look at, if you squint a bit. You're a disgrace to us all. They call you the freak. Did you know that? The undesirable one. Heartless, cold, and proud. You'll never find a match. You'll die a lonely, bent old spinster. You know that? By your leave, exalted sister,
Kahina said, curtsying once more.
I will see you punished for your part in this. A marriage to Teclau Guntat will give me power to dispose of who I choose. Do what you will. I care not.
Another vase shattered against the wall. Kahina turned and stalked out. Marie glared at her as she left, and then closed the door quietly behind her, before turning back to her mistress. Karin collapsed on her bed, a low, keening wail escaping her. Marie went to her side, torn with worry. Karin looked up, her face streaked, her makeup smudged and stained. In all these years, Marie had never seen her mistress shedding real tears. On the outskirts of Leeson City was a ruined collection of burnt-out, shattered, and barely habitable buildings. The slaves were housed further in towards the center, in purpose-built, simple but functional accommodation. They were taken to the mines by a dedicated transport link, tagged going in and out. Out here lived those who operated beyond the law, beyond surveillance. It was a dangerous place. None lived here who had a choice. Purges by the Imperials were regular, but they might as well have tried to exterminate rats. The ruins were a maze, the broken remains of the original settlers' dwellings, firebombed 3 years before after the appropriation of Keone by the Loren family and their lackeys. Around one of the ruined buildings, a series of cheap but effective motion detectors alerted their owner deep inside that somebody had passed the perimeter. Miniaturized camera drones surged to the location, quickly assessing the intruder. Cowled and cloaked, the individual's particulars adhered to previously stored scans, and the drones switched to a quiescent mode after relaying the information. In the basement, a small collection of individuals regarded each other warily. They were all dressed in tired military fatigues, grey and dusty. The bare walls ran with damp, the occupants huddled in battered chairs around a rough metal table on which lay a crumpled map.
Here, and here,
said one of them, a big, strongly muscled man, with a crew-cut hairstyle and thinning bronze hair. He jabbed at the map with grimy hands and split fingernails.
The next logical targets.
Murmurs of appreciation rose from around the table.
We should continue to spread fear and doubt. Now that the slaves have fallen victim to the Senator's madness, You lack ambition, Mitchell.
He seemed unaware that the purple birthmark that reached from his left cheek across his ear always drew a second glance. He seemed concerned more with the gun he was cleaning than the audience he addressed.
We blew up one of their administrative buildings in the heart of the city. They fear us now, Vargo. And are we closer to achieving our goal?
Vargo spared him a disinterested glance.
No, this is the time to strike. And strike hard. We need to push our advantage, not fall back.
The murmurs now took on a tone of uneasiness. Muted discussions sprang up as the two reclamists studied each other.
And what do you suggest?
Mitchell folded his arms and leant back a touch.
The Lorens are vulnerable. The slaves are ready to revolt at a moment's notice. The buyers are nervous. There is dissension in the military at being posted to this distant system with insufficient resources. The Senator's madness grows. Even the Imperials acknowledge this. Many would rather return to the Empire.
So? Mitchell demanded. Vargo rolled his eyes in an exaggerated fashion.
We give the Imperial Stards all the encouragement they need. Let them all burn. We're already overextended. Pushing further when our supplies are low. The Imperials have far worse problems than we do. The next shipment of Federation weaponry is due from Octavia in just a few days. We'll have the advantage. You throw that away?
Mitchell bristled.
Careful, Vargo.
Still debating the next move.
A third voice interrupted the debate, and its owner stepped forward into the light. All eyes turned to regard the cowled figure.
Solanac,
Vargo said, turning to face the newcomer and then winking at Mitchell.
Glad you can make it. Your advice will be much appreciated. Mitchell here thinks we've done enough and should creep away for fear of discovery. I say we press our advantage while the Imperials cower in their refuge. You?
I suggest you all consider your next move very carefully indeed,
Solanac replied, with a trace of mirth. Mitchell scoffed and turned aside. Vargo acknowledged his frustration.
Yes, I was counting on a little more than that.
We must stake our claim. We cannot wait for the Federation.
The Federation has and will continue to help us.
The Federation desires only that the Empire is frustrated. They never defended this system when they had the choice. What makes you think they will in the future? Tantalum is what they all want. Everything else is irrelevant.
Listen to him.
The Federation and the Imperials have no real interest in our world. They want only a reliable supply of tantalum. The Federation is currently denied this. The Imperials fear it will be disrupted by the Senator's behavior. If another government was formed that could broker a deal...
Deal with the Imperials and the Federation?
Mitchell said in surprise, unfolding his arms and placing his hands on his hips.
Run the mines for both powers. Ensure the trade is equitable. We mine, they protect the access,
Vargo said with a grin.
You think the Imperials will go for it?
Reliable supply coupled with no longer having to defend this system, so far from their worlds. Peaceful cooperation with the Federation rather than this endless terrorism. Their cost savings would be dramatic. They know the Federation is funding us and backing the pirates. With that obstacle removed, all parties would benefit. It is only the Loren's effective dictatorship and the position of the Senator that prevents it.
And how will we put off this amazing coup? You've just said the Federation will not help us directly. I assume you have some new information.
Vargo turned to Solonak. Solonak nodded.
The Senator's eldest daughter, Kahina Loren, is due to be married in a few short weeks. The Loren family will all be in the Imperial Palace on full display. Security will be tight, but not impregnable. With the Imperials suitably informed, the Senator and his family could be, how shall we say, encouraged to retire early.
And then? The mining rights are owned by the Lorens. If the Lorens are no more, their claim dies with them. The Imperials have no other rights to the system. Keone would belong to us once more. Our claim as settlers becomes legal. The Federation and the Empire will be forced to negotiate with us. Assassinate the entire family.
It must be done in Imperial fashion, honorably and with care, or we would fail to gain the necessary Imperial support.
Can it be done? Is Keone ours? Do we want it back? Are we prepared to fight for it?
Mitchell glared at Vargo from across the table. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the faint sounds of breathing from the rest of the Reclamists. Vargo and Mitchell continued to confront each other.
All right. I'll have a few extra special items for Octavia to deliver. Name them. I'll get them. I mean, assuming...
Mitchell nodded. He looked at Solonak.
We can trust this information.
Have I ever let you down?
Looking forward to the day you do. Enough. Keone will be ours again.
Vargo snapped. He looked around at the rest of the Reclamists.
Keone is ours. Keone is ours. Keone is ours. Keone is ours.
The cry was taken up. The Reclamists, led by Vargo, chorused it again and again, rising to a crescendo. Eyes blazed with zeal, fists punched the air. The decision was made. Patron Dolk Torgan arrived at the Imperial Palace later that day, taking a swift airship from the continent. Favoured by the Senator, he was entitled to land the small vessel on the private landing area immediately below the palace grounds. From there he strode up through the ornamental gardens and onto the wide gravelled colonnade that led to the palace. Dolk, surprised as always at how the imposing building rose above him, cast an appraising eye over it once more. It was classic in the manner of imperial fashion, with a mix of baroque spinnerets and sweeping buttresses. The palace was clad in white marble, but reinforced with various alloys for strength. It could easily serve as a fortress. Dolk proceeded up the colonnade to the main entrance, an enormous arch of obsidian, fashioned to resemble the entrance to the Hall of Martyrs on distant Achenar. Dolk smiled inwardly. Senator Orgreb's desire for immortality was plain to see. 2 flamewood doors, secured with bright steel reinforcements, barred the way, but slowly and silently swung outwards as Dolk approached. There were no guards in evidence, but all movements were being watched. Dolk could sense them, appropriately concealed, but poised to act at a moment's notice. The Senator's youngest daughter was waiting for him in the vaulted foyer, standing on the bottom step of the wide and imposing staircase that led to the upper levels, her features illuminated by the bright sunshine streaming through the entrance. Without a word, Dolk turned and walked to the right and down a flight of stairs. Kahina followed him without question.
You have displeased the Senator once again,
Dolk said. It wasn't a question.
He has displeased me.
You seem to believe your opinion has some merit. You are unrepentant. This is not acceptable. You bring these punishments upon yourself.
They are mine to bear. I will not comply with his wishes.
We shall see about that.
Dolk led her downwards into the depths of the palace. They reached a door which responded to Dolk's palm by opening inwards. Dolk gestured to Kahina and she stepped inside. No tapestries adorned the walls that rose, bright white from the polished wooden floor. Instead, weaponry surrounded them. Primitive knives, whips and chains, gleaming sword blades, pistols and automatic rifles. Dolk closed the door behind him and turned to face Kahina. A faint grin crossed his face.
Alone now, and away from prying eyes and ears.
Kahina stepped back a pace, swallowing hard. Dolk loosened the clasps on his trench coat, revealing a leather tunic and breeches beneath. A thick belt girded his waist, from which hung an ornate scabbard. From it he drew a thin sword, embellished with filigree of high craftsmanship. Light from the overhead illumination flickered from it as he brandished it with a small flourish. Kahina's eyes followed the sword warily.
Your father insists you need treatment for your illness,
Dolk said, stepping aside and sweeping the sword in a downward arc.
And yet I stand here full of vigor,
Kahina countered, and moved to keep the same distance between them. Dolk smiled.
A sickness of the mind, perhaps.
A disobedient daughter is the curse of many a father.
A euphemism for torture, then. To convince you to change your ways,
Dolk said, regarding her carefully. She matched his footwork, step for step.
My ways will never change.
Fighting talk from a mere girl with no rank.
Cowardice from an old man armed with a sword against an undefended lady.
A lady? Without the Loren locks of gold and clear blue eyes?
Is there some rule that states a woman must be blonde to be considered worthy?
Dolk grinned and gestured to the walls.
Let's find out.
Kahina walked across to the nearest side and retrieved a sword, her eyes never leaving Dolk's. She returned to the center of the room and then, without warning, lunged at Dolk. Sword point aimed directly at his heart. Dolk turned aside in a flash, parrying the strike with his own sword. Sparks flew from the blades as they clashed. A flick of his wrist and Kahina was pushed back. Both dropped into a ready stance, slowly circling each other.
I'm gratified to see that you've not forgotten your last lesson.
I learn fast and practice daily,
Kahina said, lunging forward again. A rapid series of strikes and parries followed. Dolk turned her sword once again, sending her reeling off balance. She spun to face him again.
Much still to learn.
I'll have you one day, old man.
Kahina struck a third time. This time, Dolk deftly twisted his wrist and Kahina's sword clattered across the floor. His blade swung rapidly, stopping just short of her neck.
But not this day. You're dead once more.
Kahina grabbed his wrist in her hands, twisted violently, and his sword fell from his grasp. She bent his arm backwards at the shoulder, pulling him off balance.
You told me never to stop fighting until I could fight no more,
she said, bending his arm cruelly, hoping to see a flicker of pain on his face. She was disappointed. Instead, Dolk dropped to his knees, spun, and abruptly rotated his hips. Kahina was flung over him, to land with a heavy thud on the floor behind him. She gasped in surprise and pain. The breath knocked from her. A fist had stopped just short of her nose.
A lesson you've yet to completely appreciate,
he said with a nod, before opening his hand and helping her to her feet. Kahina winced as her strained muscles protested. Dolk studied her for a moment. The girl showed occasional flashes of skill with both the blade and her unarmed technique, but she never quite seemed to manage a strong level of consistency. But she's learnt enough. Enough to survive.
Why do you do this, Dolk? You disobey my father's wishes. The risk.
I do not agree with torturing innocent women. You've committed no crime other than knowing your own mind. You deserve more than your station allows.
Could you torture me, should you wish to?
Dolk fixed her with a stare.
Why do you think your father chose me?
I imagine you've done worse in your time.
You imagine correctly.
You fought for the independent world, so it's told. Your prowess speaks for itself.
I fought for them all. But that was a long time ago. My place is here, serving the Loren family.
You served my father, no?
Indeed. But we must all look to the future. Your father will not be senator forever.
Some might say those are the words of a traitor, Patron Dolk.
Kahina's eyes flashed with amusement.
Mere fact, nothing else. Age takes us all in time. Nothing remains constant.
Kahina laughed.
I will puncture your composure one day. Trust me.
Perhaps the reclamists will succeed in their aims. Perhaps the slaves will revolt and overrun the administration. Perhaps the Empire will intervene.
A catalogue of possible woes.
Or perhaps another senator may emerge from the esteemed Loren lineage. Whosoever they might be, they must be prepared for the task ahead. Strong, sound of mind and purpose. Would you not agree?
Kahina made a dismissive sound.
I have not the tact for politics.
You did well in diverting that Rebian wastrel, but take care not to antagonize others unless unavoidable. Cultivate allies as well as enemies, and perhaps you may find yourself in a position of opportunity.
I'm in debt to your guidance, wise old man. Will you always guide me?
Dolk looked at her appraisingly, and then picked up her sword, tossing it towards her. Kahina caught it expertly by the hilt and spun her wrist around with a quick, circular movement before dropping into a ready stance.
More bruises?
Your treatment must look compelling. I have a reputation to maintain.
Come and get me, old man.
Their swords clashed again. Sparks flew.